Hi guys, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria. So in the past I've spoken quite a lot about British military sabres and indeed about Indian swords, and I've also talked a little bit about cross-pollination between the two cultures and the two weapon types. What I have in my hand here, and I have spoken about these before, is a British-made tulwar. So a lot of people would look at this and go, that's an Indian tulwar. Well, technically it is. It was made for Indian military forces. However, it is marked on the blade as being made by Mole of Birmingham. And in actual fact, I've owned 3 of these now, and they're all almost identical. They vary only very slightly. And it's very clear that Mole of Birmingham, Robert Mole and Sons, that is, who were gun and sword makers in Birmingham, very successful. They had a War Department contract. They made lots of bayonets and lances and cutlasses and boarding pikes and all sorts of things for the government, for the British government. Also with the official suppliers to the India Stores Depot, ISD. If you have a bayonet or a sword which has ISD stamped on it, that stands for India Stores Depot, and it means that it was an official purchase by the British government to supply Indian military forces up until about, I think, until about 1920, something like that, after the First World War. So it's very clear that Robert Mole and Sons of Birmingham were making entire complete tulwars like this. However, as I've mentioned previously, we do see the other way around. We do see British swords which have Indian influence to them. For example, there are British officers' sabres, or at least the hilt of a sabre with a tulwar blade. And we even, see it the other way around to an extent, in that we sometimes see European blades on tulwar hilts. But what I've got here, if you just bear with me a second, is a rather unusual sword that I've just acquired that is something else, something a little bit different. So first of all, if we look at it, it looks like a British officer's sabre. At least the form of the hilt is roughly what we would call a Gothic style hilt, which is based on the 1827 pattern rifle officer's hilt. However, it's a little bit different. Firstly, the grip is made of a dark wood. It's got brass wire in there. So it is clearly inspired by the British officers, the rifle officers in fact, officer's sword. But it's just the form and the shape of it slightly different. And then instead of having the bugle symbol, or indeed the crown cipher here, I don't know whether I think you can just see that on the camera, there we go. Just there we have an Indian katar, which is like a punch dagger. Okay, so this is for one of the, and I haven't quite identified which one yet, but for one of the independent or semi-independent Indian states that weren't under direct British control. They weren't officially part of the empire, but they were allied with and essentially under quite enforced to an extent influence of the empire. So they were having an officer's sword that looks like a British officer's sword at first glance, like obviously a military officer's sword, but they don't have the British crown symbol or military regiment symbol there, because they're not part of the British military system officially. However, even more noticeable, if we just pan out there, we'll see the scabbard obviously contains a blade that you can tell the shape of, very curved. But the scabbard itself is actually made with, I think it's usually donkey leather, because of course cow leather wasn't used by Hindus and pig skin wasn't generally used by Muslims, so donkey leather was very popular for scabbards because it wouldn't offend either side. And it's a completely typical traditional tulwar style scabbard, and then inside we have what's actually almost like a shamsher blade. It's very curved. There's a possibility this is wood, so I haven't actually investigated to find out yet. I'll have to use a light acid agent to try and bring out any pattern if it's there. But it seems like a good quality blade. And the reason I call it a I just put the scabbard down for a second. The reason I call it a shamsher blade rather than a tulwar blade is because of the extreme curve, but also because there's no fullers and the cross section is very wedge-like. So it's actually more like Arabic blades, really, more than a typical tulwar blade. Typical tulwar blades tend to not be this curved, and they tend to have a bit more mass at this portion of the blade. So an interesting sword, a very highly curved Arabic type blade with a hilt that's very clearly inspired by British officers' swords, but very clearly also not a British officer's sword. I would say almost certainly this is made for either an Indian officer in an independent Indian state, probably in the late 19th century, perhaps about 1880, something like that, or possibly, and this is only a very slight possibility, a European officer, not always British, could be French, could be German, officer serving in an independent Indian state. So an officer of unknown origin, but probably Indian, with a military hilt inspired by British fashions, but with a native, should we call it, sort of tulwar or shamshir type blade in a native scabbard. And just to compare, you'll notice the blade is very different of the tulwar below, which is the sort of the British made version of a tulwar, which looks almost typical tulwar shape except for the point, which is what we call a spear point, where the point's in the middle rather than the back. That's a British feature rather than an Indian feature. So the tulwar compared to this, very, very different swords. So there we go. The cross-pollination could go both directions and end up in all sorts of different types of swords for use by different people, but in the same period of time. There we go, guys, an interesting sword for you. Cheers.
Click subscribe now and also follow us on Facebook.